Hello everyone, it's Instructor Hollon, and this lecture is on ethical egoism. Let's begin with some key definitions. By altruism, I mean concern for the well-being of others. By egoism, I mean a concern for one's own self-interest. And hedonism can be defined as a concern for pleasure, and the idea that personal pleasure, is the ultimate good or motivation. So to turn to ethical egoism, there are three different types of egoism at which we'll be looking today. The first one is psychological egoism. The second one is ethical egoism. And that will be the one with which we're primarily concerned. And the third one is the social contract theory, and this can be thought of as a more sophisticated version of a type of ethical egoism. So let's begin with psychological egoism. Kao defines psychological egoism in the following way. Psychological egoists argue that everything we do is self-serving, even if we might think it is not. And this is in Kao, What's in It for Me on Egoism and Social Contract Theory in the Matthews textbook, 2020, page 37. Psychological egoism says that people basically act with their own self-interest in mind. Bernard Manville is an exponent of this position. You could find his writing, Human Beings Are Selfish, in the Archie Reader from 2004, pages 276 to 288. So for ethical egoism, there are two main views. On one interpretation, it says that people are basically selfish. On the other interpretation, it says that people may act with long-term self-interest in mind, so immediate selfish drives are not necessarily a factor. Okay, so one version is more short-sighted, and the other version is looks kind of down the road, so to say, thinks about long-term effects and ways to maximize pleasure in the long run. Okay, so let's look at then, having defined psychological egoism, let's look at psychological egoism and some of its problems. So some take psychological egoism for granted. Okay, they point to observations for support, and there's no short supply of examples. This is the strategy of Glaucon in Plato's famous story, The Ring of Gyges. See 11, 2019, pages 158 to 167, and the Archie Reader 2004, pages 268 to 275. However, psychological egoists share a heavy burden of proof because two significant problems arise. First, observations also demonstrate altruistic behavior. And this is an argument David Hume makes in Egoism is Mistaken, in the Archie Reader, 2004, pages 237 to 247. Picking egoism over altruism then looks arbitrary. We could point to observations and examples where people behave selfishly, but we could just as easily point to examples where people behave altruistically. And so then why preference one over the other? So the second problem is that we can be sure about egoistic motivations. The second problem questions whether we can be sure about egoistic motivations, given the insights of modern psychoanalytic and depth psychology. How do we assess motivations for actions when people are often unsure about their own motivations? Okay. Now, to see more on this problem, look at Kao, What's in It for Me on Egoism and Social Contract Theory in Matthews, 2020, page 38. So let's look at the theory that with which we're primarily concerned in the field of ethics, ethical egoism. Kao further defines ethical egoism in the following way. Ethical egoism claims that one should pursue one's own best interest. Notice the presence of the word should there. It's not just an observational claim about what people do, but it's a claim about what we should do. Okay, and that's the primary distinction between psychological and ethical egoism. Ethical egoism adds that normative claim. So for this definition, see KO, What's in It for Me on Egoism and Social Contract Theory in Matthew's 2020, page 39. Early advocates of this view include Epicurus, Pleasure is the Good in the Archie and Archie Reader, 2004, pages 212 to 226. There are likewise narrow and broad interpretations of ethical egoism. The narrow view says that I ought to act in my own best interests. It focuses on the individual. The broad view says that people ought to act in their own best interests. And so the broad view is pluralistic, looks at how other individuals should behave as well. So now let's look at some problems with ethical egoism. Some problems arise with ethical egoism, and the first one is that we cannot look to see how people generally act in order to say that people ought to act that way. This is the problem raised by Hume's law. Notice, again, you can revisit this problem in the Dimmock and Fisher text, 2017, pages 103 to 104. So with regard to the is ought problem, then, if you recall, there may be, in some cases, problems with using natural observations to guide normative claims about how people should or shouldn't behave. But there may also be some good examples, so it's not so cut and dry. This creates a problem here because we can't take it for granted then that all we need to do is look at observations to tell us how we should behave. So we also do not want to just assume that ethical egoism is true. So we need to do a little more work. Second, the broad interpretation sounds incoherent since our own best interests may conflict with the interests of others, right? So on the broad view, if we say people should be concerned with their own self-interests, we create a problem when multiple self-interests come into conflict, and the theory doesn't give us any way to judge or adjudicate between self-interests. Whose self-interest should we uphold versus someone else's when they conflict, right? It's just arbitrary at that point, the selection. So how can we say that everyone ought to act in their own self-interests when we know that conflicts will arise? So the narrow interpretation of ethical egoism also faces the problem of the prisoner's dilemma. This problem arises when we look at agreements from an ethical egoist perspective. Imagine that police officers have arrested two people, X and Y, and have them in separate rooms. They offer a deal to each one. They've each committed a crime. If they betray the other suspect, they can walk free instead of spending 20 years in prison. If they betray each other, though, they will each spend 10 years in prison. If they both keep their mouths shut and trust each other, then they will both walk free. Clearly, the best option here is for them to not betray each other. Then they could walk free. But if they both suspect each other of being egoists and of pursuing their own self-interests, they will not trust each other and so will not be able to keep their mouths shut. In this case, one will either betray the other or both will betray the other. In all likelihood, if they're thinking of each other as egoists, they'll both betray each other. This dilemma is thought to show that egoism is insufficient to support keeping promises and agreements. To motivate this behavior, then, morality must enter the discussion. So still, if there are egoists who think that they can break moral principles and get away with it, then something like an enforcement machine is needed. And this is where the idea of the social contract arises. For discussion of the way the for discussion of the prisoner's dilemma and the way egoists can try to respond in this way, see Hill, Game Theory, the Nash Equilibrium, and the Prisoner's Dilemma, and the Levin Reader, the Levin text, 2019, pages 149 to 156. This brings us to the social contract theory. The social contract theory says that people give up some of their self-interests in order to preserve others. That's Matthew's 2020, pages 40 to 43. It's a kind of trade-off between self-interests then. Short-sighted self-interests and long-term self-interests. Also, personal self-interests versus the self-interests of others. However, as Ko argues, the prisoner's dilemma still arises for social contract theorists. For social contract theorists, the social contract theory, be it Hobbes, Gutierrez, or Rawls, can still suffer from the prisoner's dilemma, where everyone rationally acts in a self-interested way, even when doing so is detrimental for the good of all involved. For more on this problem, see Ko, What's in It for Me on Egoism and Social Contract Theory in Matthews 2020, page 43, footnote 3. This problem is acknowledged by Hill, who offers an even-handed defense of social contract theory. The non-cooperative solutions in general remain equilibria. So cooperation is fragile and not inevitable. Okay, so for this response and admission, see Hill, Game Theory, the Nash Equilibrium, and the Prisoner's Dilemma in 2019, page 155. So what Cal is saying is that that working with each other to maximize self-interest makes some sense in some cases, but not in all cases. We can imagine how this problem can emerge in a couple of different ways. But say, for example, you can get away with committing a crime, doing so might hinder the affect the self-interests of others. Well, egoism says you should do that, right? But the social contract theory says, well, maybe you shouldn't do that for the long run, right? But the problem is, in some cases, you could probably get away with the crime, and it won't affect the overall majority, the self-interest of the majority, so long as everyone doesn't go commit that crime or something like that. So there is still a problem here. So let's look at the idea then of self-interested motivation for action. The moral point of view. We can ask whether or not it is possible for someone to act in a desired way, for example, the moral way, even though they are not moral. If someone was told not to lie because others would not trust them, and not to steal because others would steal from them, etc., we could still question whether this person was really moral after all. The problem is that concerns their motivations for the action. Then they may avoid certain actions not because they are wrong and do other things because they are right, but could merely be acting out of their conditioning or programming, in which case they don't really understand the moral dimension of the action. So it is possible that they do not even know what wrong or right mean. So thus, more than action is needed, and some real understanding is also needed. The appropriate psychological reflection or understanding, then, is needed to mark a moral life. So egoism ignores this inner quality and says, well, so long as people behave in a certain way and don't conflict with they can maximize their self-interests, and then in the more enlightened view, maybe forego some self-interests in the interests of others to maximize their interests in the long run. They may behave in those ways and still never really understand right from wrong. Okay. So now let's turn to the why be moral question then on this view. In light of our discussion of ethical egoism, ethicists ponder the why be moral question. Why should someone choose to lead a moral life when it is not in their self-interest to do so? Plato confronts this problem in his famous story of the Ring of Gyges. See Levin 2019, pages 158 to 167. And see the Archie and Archie Reader 2004, pages 268 to 275. In this story, Gyges discovers a ring with the power of invisibility. And this reminds you of the Lord of the Rings story, right? With the hobbits. Well, so in this story, Gyges finds the ring, and if he turns it a certain way, he can turn invisible. The challenge of the story is to justify moral behavior, then, when Gyges can commit crimes with impunity. The problem, then, is that the thought experiment asks us to try to answer this question. Why should we be moral, in Gyges' case, if we find a ring that can turn us invisible? Because if we can turn invisible, we can do anything we want and not get caught. so we can do anything we want without fear of punishment or consequence, with impunity. And so if we have that power to do anything we want and get away with it, why would we behave morally then? That's the challenge. So this is the challenge for the moral question. Why be moral when we can get away with bad behavior that may benefit us? Socrates, using Plato as Plato, using Socrates as a mouthpiece, argues that we must choose justice for its own sake, for its own intrinsic value. Glaucon will argue that people behave selfishly, and that's just how it is. Okay, so they have a disagreement there about the nature of justice. So in addition to the readings then, the assigned readings that I've cited, suggested readings, anything that I might have included, I've also attached some multimedia in the Engaging with the Materials link in this week's module, course module, and you can find these in the written lecture link for engaging with the materials. I recommend viewing these to help learn some of the concepts and some of the content if it makes it easier. It's beneficial. They're also enjoyable and just can make the material funner to interact with. There's a helpful summary of the prisoner's dilemma too, and explanation of some of the theories like egoism in general and the social contract theory. So if you have any questions about ethical egoism specifically, but really any version of egoism at which we looked in this lecture, please feel free to send me an email. Questions about the theories, objections, etc. Send me an email, or you can drop in on virtual office hours, or raise a question in the discussion forums, and I'm happy to respond and provide some guidance. Okay, so thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.